U.S., Canadian, and European airlines suspend all flights to Tel Aviv after rockets fired by Hamas land near the Israeli airport. Good evening. I'm Judy Woodruff.
And I'm Gwen Eiffel. Also ahead this Tuesday, European Union leaders meeting in Brussels impose additional sanctions on Russia in the wake of the shootdown of Malaysia Air Flight 17.
Plus, how charter and traditional public schools in Houston are partnering up to share space, resources, and improve education.
KIPP and Landrum hire their own teachers for core courses like math and reading. It's here in the elective courses, band, orchestra, choir, art, theater, and phys ed, that the charter and traditional schools come together.
Those are just some of the stories we're covering on tonight's PBS NewsHour.
It's been 5 days since a Malaysian Airlines plane was shot down over eastern Ukraine, and today 200 of the 298 victims reached the first stop on the way home. Neil Connery of Independent Television News filed this report from Ukraine.
After a 17-hour journey, the train carrying the bodies of flight MH17's victims finally arrived in Kharkiv. A former tank factory in the Soviet era turned into a makeshift morgue, now offering some sort of sanctuary before the final journey home. There was at last here dignity for the dead. One Malaysian official on board the train told me great care is being taken here.
They were taken from the train to the building because they are going to make sure that it was kept properly.
Most of the victims from flight MH17 are now finally under the protection of the Ukrainian and Dutch authorities in this site behind me. Their families have had to wait 5 long and agonizing days for this to happen, but they are now finally about to head home. Back at the crash site, international observers say they fear the aircraft's wreckage may have been tampered with.
The other day when we were at the cockpit section, when we were leaving, we did see workers using a diesel-powered saw to get a closer look at the fuselage. We can't draw any conclusions, that's not our role, but it's an observation that we made.
The black box flight recorders were finally handed over to the Malaysian authorities by the pro-Russia militia in Donetsk in the early hours. They're now being sent to air accident investigators in Britain to be downloaded for the Dutch to then analyse them. A small memorial service was held next to the wreckage. The 298 lives extinguished at 33,000 feet last Thursday were remembered by villagers. The bodies of those victims will leave this makeshift morgue behind these gates and return to the Netherlands tomorrow, each one laid in a coffin.
Later, a European monitor said his team saw no sign of any attempt to recover the human remains still at the crash site. We'll turn to the day's diplomatic developments later in the program.
And in other news this day, President Obama's nominee to head the Department of Veterans Affairs promised today that he will work to sort out a scandal over health care delays. Former Procter & Gamble CEO Robert McDonald appeared at a Senate confirmation hearing. He said the challenges include long treatment delays, falsified appointment records, and the VA's very culture.
The department's problems with access, transparency, and accountability and integrity are all well documented. There's a lot of work to do to transform the department. It won't be easy, but it is essential and it can be achieved. The seriousness of this moment demands action.
If McDonald is confirmed, he would replace retired General Eric Shinseki, who resigned in May under mounting pressure. Meanwhile, Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid said today there has been some progress on congressional funding to address the VA's problems.
Researchers in the U.S. and Britain say they've taken a big step toward developing future drug treatments for schizophrenia. They reported today the largest ever genetic study of the disease has identified 108 DNA markers. Schizophrenia makes it difficult to distinguish between what is real and what is not. It affects 1 of every 100 people, and in the U.S. alone costs about $60 billion a year to treat.
The president of Nigeria, Goodluck Jonathan, held his first meeting today with parents of girls abducted by Boko Haram militants in April. The meeting took place at the presidential villa in the capital, Abuja. Later, in a statement, Jonathan said his goal is to free the 219 girls still captive and to rout Boko Haram from Nigeria. But news reports say the insurgents overran more territory in the northeastern part of the country just in the past few days, an army base and surrounding villages.
Election officials in Indonesia have declared a winner in the bitterly disputed presidential race. Jakarta Governor Joko Widodo won 53% of the vote. He celebrated with supporters today and appealed for unity in the world's third largest democracy. Earlier, though, the other candidate, former General Prabowo Subianto, withdrew from the contest and charged it was all a sham.
There has been a massive fraud, structured and systematic, in the 2014 elections. In consideration of this, we, the presidential candidate Prabowo Subianto and running mate Hatta Rajasa, will use our constitutional rights to reject the 2014 election.
Despite that claim, the defeated candidate opted against challenging the results in court.
Dozens of police were rounded up in Turkey today, accused of spying on Prime Minister Recep Tayyip Erdogan and others. They were charged with using a corruption probe as a cover. In another development, Erdogan said he no longer speaks directly with President Obama. He told a TV interviewer it's because the U.S. failed to take stronger action in Syria.
In South Korea, police announced they found the country's most wanted fugitive, the man whose family owned the ferry that sank in April. The decomposed body of Yoo Byung-un turned up in a farm field more than a month ago, but it took lab tests to confirm the identity. Yoo disappeared after the ferry disaster that killed more than 300 people. Investigators do not suspect foul play in his death.
Back in this country, Detroit's plans to shed debt and emerge from bankruptcy have won a big boost from active and retired city employees. An overwhelming majority of them voted to accept pension cuts as part of the effort to cut the city's long-term debt of $18 billion. A federal bankruptcy judge holds a hearing next month on approving the city's plan.
On Wall Street today, the Dow Jones Industrial Average gained more than 61 points to close at 17,113. The Nasdaq rose 31 points to close at 4456, and the S&P 500 added nearly 10 to finish at 1983. Still to come on the NewsHour, several airlines cut off flights to Tel Aviv. Europe brings additional sanctions against Russia. Bridging the chasm between charter and traditional public schools, 2 federal courts issue conflicting rulings on the health care law. And 10 years after the 9/11 Commission report was published, how safe are we?
The battle between Hamas and Israel raged on and prompted some commercial airlines to cancel flights to Tel Aviv. By night, Israeli airstrikes and artillery fire kept up a heavy barrage in Gaza City. By day, Palestinians again counted casualties. Now more than 600 dead, more than 500 homes destroyed, and raged against their attackers.
There is no excuse. They killed innocent children, women, and elders who were using this building as shelter. They thought this place was safe.
Hamas struck back with new rocket fire, hitting a house in Tel Aviv's Yehud suburb and lightly wounding one Israeli. It was the closest strike yet to the Ben Gurion International Airport, and several U.S., European, and Canadian airlines temporarily halted service to Israel. The Israeli Transportation Ministry criticized the move, saying it would hand terror a prize. On the ground, military officials acknowledged the deaths of 2 more soldiers. They also announced a 21-year-old sergeant, Oron Shaul, is missing and presumed dead after a battle Sunday. Hamas had claimed it captured an Israeli soldier over the weekend. But Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu vowed to keep up the assault after meeting with UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon in Tel Aviv.
What grievance can we solve for Hamas? Their grievance is that we exist. They don't even want a 2-state solution. They don't want any state solution. In the face of such extremism, in the face of such violence, in the face of such terror, Israel has no option but to defend itself. And this is what we are doing.
Secretary General Bond, who will meet with the Palestinian Prime Minister in the West Bank tomorrow, urgently appealed for the shooting to stop.
My message to Israelis and Palestinians is the same. Stop fighting, start talking, and take on the root causes of the conflict so we are not back to the same situation in another 6 months or a year.
Later, in a video conference with the UN Security Council, Bond said it is his hope and belief the fighting will end in the very near future. Meanwhile, in Cairo, Secretary of State John Kerry continued the U.S. push for a ceasefire, meeting with Egypt's leaders and the head of the Arab League.
And while we still obviously have work to do, it's also clear to me from each of the parties that I've met with that there is a framework available to end the violence. And that framework is the Egyptian initiative that has been put forward.
The Egyptian ceasefire proposal is backed by both the U.S. and Israel, but has so far been rejected by Hamas. The militant group, with support from Turkey and Qatar, has demanded an end to the blockade that has crippled Gaza's economy.
For more on the FAA's suspension of flights to Israel, the broader efforts to broker a ceasefire in the conflict there, and the latest on the situation in Ukraine, we turn to Ben Rhodes, Deputy National Security Advisor to the President. I spoke to him a short while ago. Ben Rhodes, thank you for talking with us. We've just reported that the FAA and other safety agencies have halted commercial traffic into Ben Gurion Airport in Tel Aviv. We know the Israelis are saying that that's not necessary. It hands terror a prize. We know Prime Minister Netanyahu has called Secretary of State Kerry to try to reverse the decision. What does the president believe about this?
Well, Judy, it's important to understand that the FAA takes certain precautions out of abundance of caution. And what the FAA said is that a rocket fired by Hamas landed roughly a mile from Ben Gurion Airport. That triggers the warning from the FAA to U.S. carriers to avoid landing in Ben Gurion. Again, that's because we don't want to put our civil aviation at risk. They'll review this every 24 hours. But again, this was done in accordance with our common practice. If you see that kind of threat in the vicinity of an airport, we have to issue a warning to civilian carriers to avoid that airport.
So the president is not inclined to reverse the decision of the FAA?
No, we wouldn't want to overrule something that the FAA is doing for the protection of Americans and those flying on American carriers. Again, we can review those decisions based on the security situation on a 24-hour basis. But we believe it's necessary, particularly when we see what happened in Ukraine, that we are taking great care when it comes to the safety of our air carriers.
Well, when it comes to the fighting in Gaza, between Gaza and Israel, we know there are over 600 Palestinians dead, 3/4 of them civilians, 1/4 of them children. We know that there are problems with water supply. We now know there are 29 Israelis dead. When does this situation become intolerable for the president?
Well, Judy, we believe that the best course of action is for there to be an immediate ceasefire. We've long said that Hamas is responsible for the conflict because they precipitated it with this rocket fire. Israel does have a right to defend itself against rocket fire, against tunnel attacks, but at the same time, we've been heartbroken over the loss of innocent life on the Palestinian side, the growing death toll on the Israeli side. And again, we believe the best outcome is an immediate ceasefire that restores calm and that deals with the threat of rocket fire from Hamas. Clearly, part of any ceasefire would have to be that that rocket fire stops and that we're taking steps to address the Hamas stockpiles of rockets.
So you're saying that Hamas is the holdup here. Secretary Kerry now is saying that the Egyptian proposal has been agreed to by the Israelis. He is saying Hamas is the holdup. So you're saying that's the administration position?
Yes, absolutely. Israel has indicated an openness to the Egyptian ceasefire proposal. We're now working to try to get Hamas agreement to this so that there can be a restoration of calm and an end to the loss of life that we've seen in recent days.
Do you think you're any closer to seeing that happen?
Well, Secretary Kerry's been doing consultations in the region. Those have moved forward. Again, it will take an extra push from those who have influence on Hamas to try to get them to come into compliance with the ceasefire. We were able to achieve that in 2012, the last time we saw a conflict like this. And that's what Secretary Kerry is going to keep pressing in the region, talking to Egypt and other countries and partners as well.
Let me turn you to Ukraine. Senior U.S. intelligence officials just late today are telling reporters that the passenger jet, the Malaysian jet, was likely felled by an SA-11 surface-to-air missile fired by the pro-Russian separatists, but that they don't have direct evidence of Russian involvement. Does this mean the administration can prove that this came from within separatist-controlled territory?
That's right, Judy. Again, what we assess and what we've seen in our intelligence is that there was an SA-11 system that was the likely missile that brought down the plane, and that the geographic space from where that missile was shot is controlled by the Russian-backed separatists. I wouldn't absolve Russia of responsibility for this at all. Number one, because they've created this climate of arming separatists and stoking the conflict in eastern Ukraine. And number two, because we're still looking very hard at whether or not that SA-11 system came from Russia and whether there was Russian training on that system. So that's what we're still running down, because we have seen Russian provision of arms, including anti-aircraft systems, to the separatists. So that's something that we're going to continue to pull the thread on.
Well, can you share the evidence that the missile was fired from territory controlled by the separatists?
Yeah, the intelligence community is working to declassify and put out all the information we have, and that includes our assessment of where the missile was fired from, which is a Russian separatist-controlled area. And also, again, our assessment is that this is a missile that goes basically directly up. The wreckage, of course, also fell in Russian separatist-controlled areas as well. So to us, everything points to the fact that this was a missile that was likely fired by those Russian-backed separatists.
And do you believe you will be able to prove one way or another if the missile launcher was provided by Russia? Do you expect to get fragments from the crash site? I ask because there are reports that the crash area has been tampered with.
Well, that's one of the reasons why we need international investigators to get access to that site, because we believe that there would be forensic evidence in that crash site that could further corroborate what we've determined here regarding the SA-11 and perhaps where it came from as well. So we are very concerned about reports of tampering. It is the case that in these types of investigations, good forensic work can determine what it is that brought down a plane. I would note, Judy, for instance, though, there have been reports, of course, of the black boxes being provided out of the separatist-controlled areas. That is not sufficient. A black box would not tell you exactly what felled the airplane. It would just tell you about the airplane's flight path. So that's not sufficient. That's why we're working to get that access. We passed a UN Security Council resolution yesterday. We're working to get teams on the ground. And the United States has FBI and NTSB teams on the ground in Ukraine to assist with that investigation.
And just quickly, Ben Rhodes, about the European partners of the United States. So far, they have not been willing to go along with tougher so-called sectoral economic sanctions, as the U.S. has been urging. What does this say about the unwillingness of Europeans to punish Russia or punish Russia and its policy for what happened here?
Well, we've been coordinating with the Europeans in putting sanctions on Russia. We did move into sanctions in different Russian sectors. The president's been working the phones with his European counterparts, and what we saw today is the European foreign ministers met, and there was actually a positive statement coming out of that meeting indicating that they are giving instructions to prepare designations in different sectors, and they named the energy sector, the arms sector, the financial sector. Those are exactly where we've been targeting our sanctions. So we're optimistic that with this announcement from the European foreign ministers today, we'll see further action in the coming days and weeks in which the Europeans are moving to much stronger measures on Russia. That will have a significant impact. Even our sanctions have already led to significant downward revisions in Russia's growth rate and capital flight nearing $100 billion from Russia. Clearly, this can have a cost, and the Europeans can make that cost that much more if they follow through on the announcement that they made today.
But you're saying you don't know if they're going to follow through. We
anticipate that they will. They were very specific today, again, in saying that they've given instructions to prepare designations and sanctions targets within these sectors. We're going to work with them as they prepare those, so we're coordinated with them as well. And I'd expect there to be further announcements from the Europeans in the days ahead.
Ben Rhodes joining us from the White House. We thank you.
Thanks very much.
And so we take a closer look at Europe's response. Today, they did impose new sanctions on individual Russian officials. And as we just heard, they may consider even tougher measures later this week. Gary Gibbon of Independent Television News reports from Brussels.
The US government's been telling European governments they need to wake up. They've been too reluctant to punish Russia for its actions in Ukraine, too keen to protect their own contracts. At its meeting of foreign ministers in the wake of the Malaysian air disaster, Europe feels it has done just that. They opened with a minute's silence. The Dutch foreign minister then spoke passionately to EU colleagues of his country's loss, how he'd known 7 people on the flight, how Russian-backed separatists might be tampering with the evidence at the crash scene. Europe, he said after the meeting, had toughened its stance.
I'm happy with the fact that so many of my colleagues expressed solidarity and support for the victims and their loved ones. I'm also happy that we have taken a decision which is, I think, quite forceful.
Significantly today, the Dutch became more hardline, and hawks like Sweden said it was a very different kind of meeting. President Obama said Europe needed to wake up. Do you think Europe did wake up today?
I think Europe did wake up.
And the sceptics who say actually all we've got is a list of names potentially by the end of the week that we were going to get next week anyway.
No, you weren't. No. I mean, there are things in this paper that has never been in a paper before.
Well, I'm quite new to this whole EU process, and it has its own peculiarities. But what I heard today was a clear political commitment by the foreign ministers in response to this outrage to act.
In Brussels today, they're united. The strong tendency has been for deep-seated division in Europe on Ukraine.
So what is the chance Europe will form a united front when it comes to sanctions against Russia? For that, we turn to Heather Conley. She's director of the Europe program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. She also served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs during the George W. Bush administration. Welcome.
Thank you.
So what is the significance of what EU did do today and what they didn't do?
Well, they are accelerating the preparation of more enhanced lists. So what we assume they'll produce on Thursday is an expanded list on top of the 63 individuals and entities that the EU has already sanctioned in relationship to supporting the annexation of Crimea. We expect that they will expand that list, perhaps getting a little closer to Putin's inner circle and targeting sanctioning names specifically for those that have supported the pro-Russian backed separatists. And then concurrently, they're preparing a list that will look at sectoral sanctions. So on energy, the financial sector, defense issues, dual-use technologies. We've heard Europe talk about this third phase or tier 3 sanctions since March, but we've never seen a list developed. So I think this will be a preview and a message to President Putin that should the Europeans decide to take action, they've got quite a bit of very targeted areas which would certainly hurt the Russian economy.
But you do mention that it's been since March, and it seems as if baby steps have been taken, threats have been made, not necessarily on any follow-through. What is different this time? Well,
clearly the downing of MH17 and this unbelievable tragedy and the outrage of how the deceased have been treated in eastern Ukraine has completely changed the political tenor in Europe. You have British Prime Minister David Cameron, you've heard the British Foreign Secretary Philip Hammond. They are in a new place politically, and they are willing to sacrifice some economic pain for more sanctions. The problem is all of Europe isn't in that same place.
Well, that was my next question to you. What explains the reluctance up until now and the reluctance still on the part of some European nations?
As President Bill Clinton would say, it's the economy, stupid. It is about the fragile nature of the European economy. Unemployment in the Eurozone is 11%. The French economy and the Italian economy is extremely vulnerable, may even fall into recession. And this means jobs. This means real economic impact for those who are very dependent on strong European-Russian economic ties. It is also about energy, and we can't take our eye off an upcoming winter that should Russia decide to cut off oil and gas through Ukraine, Europe would be devastated. They're very dependent.
Let's talk about two countries. Okay. Germany, 1/3 of their energy comes from Russia, and France, where we saw today they're going ahead with shipping or selling helicopter warships to Russia in spite of this. Why couldn't Francois Hollande say, to make a point, we won't give you these? And obviously he was pressured to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. This French military sale of these assault ships is the poster child for why Europe seemingly cannot take more decisive steps in light of the escalating crisis in eastern Ukraine. It means 2,500 jobs in France. It's 1.2 billion euros of sale. And even today, they were reluctant. No, we will sell that first ship, but maybe we'll postpone the second ship. Ironically, the second ship is named the Sevastopol, which of course is the capital of Crimea. Again, high symbolism. The French are starting to move a little bit, but again, not commiserate with both the tragedy and the escalating crisis in Ukraine. Germany's slightly different. I think they've acknowledged that they're going to have to go forward in some additional sanctions. The German Foreign Minister Frank-Walter Steinmeier said today, we've tried our best, we're pursuing dialogue, but we have to take some more steps to encourage Russia to take more meaningful steps.
The president, we just heard Ben Rhodes say the president's been working the phones. His chief of staff and national security advisor are in Germany today, meeting with Angela Merkel's people, and we hear tough talk coming from the Britons. So, is any of that having any persuadable effect? Does the U.S. have the leverage to make this happen?
I think the White House would have liked last week when we announced enhanced sanctions against Russia to have the Europeans right there with us, and we did it together. And we didn't.
It didn't happen.
We didn't wait for them. But what our additional leadership in the sanctions area, it sends a message to Europe that we will not wait for them. Our sanctions do have a dampening effect on Europe because as we target Russian financial entities, Russian energy entities, European companies will have a more difficult challenge in working with them if they deal in the U.S. dollar, if they deal with American institutions. There is a knock-on effect. But despite enormous amounts of pressure, and the reason that Dennis McDonough, the White House Chief of Staff, is in Berlin today is because the U.S.-German relationship
not so great right now.
Not so great. The NSA scandal and the recent revelation of our intelligence work in Germany has really damaged that relationship. So this is an uphill climb, but the Europeans themselves have to take responsibility for their security environment and their neighborhood, and we hope they get there by themselves.
Does it matter what kind of sanction we're talking about, whether it's an arms embargo, whether it's financial action, or is there any appetite to target Vladimir Putin personally?
Well, in some ways, you sort of feel it's an all of the above. I think, like the U.S. sanctions, we have targeted that inner circle around President Putin that is really shaping their support for the pro-Russian-backed separatists in eastern Ukraine. But to really get the attention of the Russian leadership and to really impact the Russian economy and to hope to change behavior, that's what we're trying to do. We're hoping to change Russian behavior. You have to focus on those sectors where they rely on Western financial support and Western know-how and technology. That's energy. That's certainly in the financial sector. Europe has enormous power to change President Putin's calculations about the costs of his support for these Russian-backed separatists. Whether they do that or not is an entirely different question.
That's exactly what we're watching to see. Heather Conley of the Center for Strategic and International Studies, thank you very much.
Thanks, Gwen.
Now, a U.S. education story with a twist. Relations between charter schools and traditional public schools have often been hostile, and that has become a more intense problem in recent years. About 4% of U.S. students attend about 5,000 charter schools. Special correspondent for education John Marrow reports on one school district that's swimming against that tide.
Students! Students!
It would be difficult to overstate the battle royal going on between traditional public schools and charter schools. Charter schools, which are publicly funded but privately run, were conceived of as testing grounds for traditional schools.
To me, charter schools are public schools that free teachers to do what teachers know best to do.
Charter schools are free to hire uncertified teachers, set their own pay scales, and fire teachers they feel aren't measuring up. From the beginning, many in education saw charter schools as a threat, robbing traditional schools of students and scarce education dollars.
We have seen constant promotion of charter, and what's happening is that in many cities today, we are on the verge of losing public education altogether.
Charter school supporters promised academic success, but the results have been mixed. Take math, for example. According to a 2013 study, 29% of charter schools do better than traditional schools, 31% do worse, and 40% score about the same. Some operators have used their charter schools as a license to steal. Today, the chasm between charter and traditional schools is greater than ever.
Good morning.
But here in Houston, Texas, in the Spring Branch School District, something astounding, even revolutionary, is taking place.
I don't see charter schools as a threat to traditional schools. I see charter schools, particularly high-performing charter schools, as kind of incubators of innovation.
Rather than go to battle, Superintendent Duncan Klusman stuck his neck out and invited two successful charter school networks into two of his schools, both of them facing declining enrollment. The charter school students are selected by a lottery.
Good morning.
Eric Schmidt is the principal of KIPP Courage, one of 141 KIPP charter schools nationwide.
Good morning, Daisy. We've got 200 students in 5th and 6th grade. We'll grow out to have 400 students in 5 through 8. And like all of our schools, we do our work in underserved communities where a majority of the students qualify for free or reduced lunch.
2 years ago, KIPP Courage began sharing space with Landrum Middle School, a traditional public school.
Good morning.
Patricia Thomas is principal of Landrum Middle School.
Our school is a grade 6 through 8 campus. We have about 750 students.
How did Thomas feel about having a newcomer, a competitor, setting up shop in her building?
A little bit leery of the program and what was going to go on. Didn't really know what the program was about, how it was going to work as a partnership.
Knowing that bringing in charter schools would be controversial, Klusman did his best to reassure his teachers.
When I met with the faculties early on, I guaranteed them that no one in Spring Branch would lose their job over this partnership.
The president of the local union, an affiliate of the American Federation of Teachers, objected.
Why is it, with the amount of leadership that we have and the amount of innovation that we have within the district, did we call it an outside source?
But teacher unions in Texas have limited power, and so Klusman's experiment continued.
All right, what's another way to write a ratio out of this information?
At Landrum, the union of charter and traditional means that KIPP math teacher Ryan Hambly has access to classroom technology he wouldn't have at KIPP.
Because we're at Landrum, we get provided 4 iPads. We get provided 4 netbooks and beautiful technology such as Promethean boards and pens.
KIPP and Landrum hire their own teachers for core courses like math and reading. It's here in the elective courses, band, orchestra, choir, art, theater, and phys ed, that the charter and traditional schools come together. On its own, KIPP could not afford to offer so many choices.
We are an envy of the town among the KIPP world because we offer so many electives.
KIPP gets the additional courses, and Landrum gets to send its teachers to KIPP's training program.
All of the elective teachers came and participated in our summer professional development that we had at KIPP, and then we also opened it up to other teachers in Landrum, core content teachers, and there was a team that came and said, we want to specifically learn about the character strengths.
Building character is uppermost in KIPP's list of educational goals.
KIPP is defined by the fact that we're 51% character, 49% academics.
KIPP's impact on Landrum seems far greater than the reverse.
Spring Branch had a program called Development Assets, Character Education, and so we kind of morphed ours to be more aligned with KIPP.
In the cafeteria, the Landrum and KIPP students may choose to eat separately, but they all spend the first few moments quietly reading or doing homework.
This was a KIPP practice where they sit down first before mass runs into the lunchroom and goes to the line.
2 years into the partnership, Landrum and KIPP are still working out the kinks. One problem? Finding time when KIPP teachers who have a longer school day can work together with Landrum teachers.
We're working on aligning our schedules for our 7th grade team of teachers next year. So we'll be adding 7th grade and have that for the first time. And so allowing teachers to have similar off time during the day so that math teachers can get together and collaborate on ideas.
Teacher turnover is also a problem. Yes Prep, the second charter school Klusman invited in, replaced 5 of its 8 teachers after the first year. 2 were promoted, 3 left, according to Yes Prep's principal, because it wasn't the right fit.
A&M, you guys averaged an 83%.
So how's this 2-year-old partnership working out? The leaders seem pleased.
I like to bounce ideas off of Eric. Him being the young guy, me the older, he might have a different idea, and vice versa.
Teachers are also generally happy with this new arrangement, according to a survey. Academically, however, the results are mixed. Reading and math scores at Landrum are flat. Those at Northbrook have improved slightly. At both schools, the charter students are generally outperforming the traditional students. And that actually benefits the traditional schools because Klusman combines the test scores when he reports them to the state.
When we report scores from the campuses, we report the school overall. For accountability reasons, all the scores are Landrum Middle School, Northbrook Middle School, Spring Branch ISD scores. They just may be in a KIPP or Yes Talk class.
Could partnerships like this one in Spring Branch catch on? Perhaps. So far, 19 school districts, including Milwaukee, Tulsa, and Denver, have come to take a look.
Now, conflicting court rulings on the health care law. The Federal Court of Appeals based in Washington ruled today that the law does not allow policyholders who get their insurance through the federal exchange to qualify for subsidies that would reduce the cost. But a separate ruling issued hours later by a federal appeals court in Richmond said those getting policies through the federal exchanges do qualify for the subsidies. The rulings come down to different interpretations of the same passage of the law. Congress said if a state did not create its own insurance exchange, the federal government should. But the law also reads that subsidies be provided by, quote, an exchange established by the state. Just 14 states, plus the District of Columbia, created their own exchanges. 5 million enrollees now receive subsidies through the federal exchange. So what do these conflicting rulings mean for the future of the health care law? For that, we turn to Julie Rovner of Kaiser Health News and Tom Goldstein, founder of SCOTUSblog.com. Let's go back to the root of this challenge, Julie. Why did this come up?
Well, because people who opposed the law found this what appeared to be a drafting error, saying that the subsidies were only available in the state-based exchange, and decided that they would sue over it to perhaps get another bite at the apple of trying to invalidate or really kind of make a mess of the rest of the law. That's what this comes down to. It's whether or not this was a mistake or whether this was something that Congress intended to do when it wrote just that one sentence about.
And the whole point of these subsidies was to put the A in affordable care, right?
That's exactly right. And if this were to go away, there's an estimate out now that about 5 million people would see premium increases of about 76%. Most of the people who are buying insurance on the exchanges are getting subsidies. Those subsidies are fairly large. If the subsidies were not available, then basically insurance would become unaffordable, and the individual mandate, the requirement for people to have insurance, does not apply to people for whom insurance is unaffordable.
Now, Tom, the D.C. court ruled today that theirs was an unambiguous reading of the law, but yet this other reading of the law seems to open the whole thing to ambiguity.
Yeah, that's right. It's a shock to everyone, I'm sure, that this huge sweeping law that takes up thousands of pages might not be perfectly clear to everyone. What the Court of Appeals in Washington today said is the language says a state-created exchange, and even if it wouldn't make a ton of sense necessarily for Congress to say part of the country has subsidies available to it and a large part of the country doesn't, That's the law that Congress wrote, and our job is just to enforce it. The Court of Appeals in Richmond said, this statute is a mess. There are things that point in different directions about what Congress wanted, and because it's unclear, it's the administration's job to figure it out.
So Congress was the one that opened the door for this kind of a challenge.
Yes, absolutely. Congress did say when there were supposed to be subsidies, but it's just a little unclear whether it literally meant only a state-created exchange, or if instead it meant if you buy your health care through the exchange and you can afford health insurance, we'll help you out.
So if the first ruling were to stand, Julie, we're assuming that the only way to address it would be for every state to set up its own exchange instead of relying on the federal one.
That would be the idea, and there's a lot of discussion already about how states could do that. In some states, so they actually passed constitutional amendments barring them from creating their own exchanges. Remember, a lot of these states run by Republicans really want nothing to do with this law.
Are there other ripple effects that affect other parts of the law as well?
Yes, it actually also affects the employer mandate, the requirement for employers to provide insurance, because that's actually tied to the subsidies that individuals get. The way the employer mandate works is it says that employers only have to pay a fine if they don't offer insurance and one of their employees goes to the exchange and gets a subsidy. So if there's no subsidy, then there's no way to enforce the employer part of this either.
Tom, it seems that we have seen enough challenges now to the health care law, including the part that was upheld by the Supreme Court and the Hobby Lobby decision about a contraceptive coverage that we saw decided in the final days of the court. It seems like death by 1,000 cuts.
Well, so far,
or attempt at death.
Exactly right. There's certainly a lot of people who are very critical of the law. They've brought very sophisticated legal challenges. The statute has been upheld by and large. This is the single greatest threat to the reach of the statute, to the attempt to help a lot of people be able to afford health care through insurance. But it is a part of the law that people find offensive in many parts of the country because they don't want the federal government so involved. It's probably going to be up to the Supreme Court, just like the last major challenges.
Are there other challenges in the pipeline, Julie?
There are a couple at lower courts. It's not entirely clear that this would produce a requirement for the Supreme Court to take the case. The administration is going to appeal to the full appeals court.
Tell me how that process works. So we're talking about two different courts in two different circuits today, and then what?
Well, right now, immediately, this was a three-judge panel of the Court of Appeals, and they will appeal to the en banc, to the entire appeals court. And generally, there are more Democratic appointees than Republican appointees there. There is at least a perception that it's likely to be reversed by the full appeals court, and then you would have basically two appeals courts having ruled and not disagreeing. So in that case, the Supreme Court wouldn't have to take the case, but not clear whether they would.
Well, remind us again, Tom, the way this works. The court then, at what point does the court have to decide whether it would intervene in this?
Well, someone has to ask. So the plaintiffs who lost in Richmond today are inevitably going to ask the Supreme Court to step in. The government could go straight to the Supreme Court, but the White House said today that it's going to ask the full Court of Appeals in Washington to hear the case. So we're probably a year to 18 months away from getting a final answer. The Supreme Court could stay out. I think it's a little bit more likely that they'll just say this is so important, and there'll be enough people on the court, enough justices who are concerned about this issue that they'll decide to take it up. But it's an open question.
Why would this be as important or more important than any of the other challenges we've seen so far? Why would the court feel compelled? You don't think the court would be compelled?
My guess would be is that if there's no split in the circuits, that the court would not really want to go back and revisit this again, unless they think they could change the decision that they got in 2012.
The most immediate question, however, Julie, for people who are watching this tonight is, how does this affect me? If they have their employer-covered insurance, it doesn't affect them at all.
No, and actually, even if they have subsidies in the federal exchange states, it doesn't affect them immediately. The way the rules work in the D.C. Circuit is that they don't even send the requirement back down to the district court, which is who would actually implement this, for 45 days to give the government time to appeal to the full appeals court, which we now know that the government is going to do. So obviously this is not going to happen right away. It would be a very long time before people would actually start losing their subsidies that they're getting now.
And potentially, how many people are we talking about who could be affected by these rulings?
5 million.
5 million who are currently in the federal exchange.
That's exactly right.
But are there others who are lined up? And we know how many people, there's so much discussion about who is registering at what pace for a long time there. But do we know if there are others who will also be affected?
Well, as more people would join the federal exchanges, obviously it would affect more people there. I've seen some numbers that go into 2016. So, I mean, it's everybody who's getting the subsidies now and everybody who's potentially eligible in those 36 states where the federal government is running the exchange.
And then we have all the employers, as you mentioned. who wouldn't be subject to the mandate that's going to come into effect in the future that they provide health insurance, because none of their employees would be getting subsidies in those states.
Is there a timetable for the courts to act again?
No, the Court of Appeals can take its time in deciding whether to have the whole court hear the case. Most likely, everyone's sensitive to the question of whether it'll go to the Supreme Court. I think you're looking at, 18 months is the best guess for when we'll have a final answer.
Oh, good. Oh, joy. Can't wait. Tom Goldstein of SCOTUS Blog, Julie Rovner of Kaiser Health News. Thank you both very much.
Thanks so much.
Finally, tonight, 10 years ago, an independent group issued a 567-page report assessing the nation's preparedness and response to the September 11th attacks. They had been tasked by Congress with providing recommendations to keep the country safe from future attacks. A decade later, the original group of 5 Democrats and 5 Republicans reconvened as part of an effort led by the Bipartisan Policy Center to produce a current assessment of the nation's threats and challenges. I spoke yesterday with the commission's chair, former New Jersey Governor Tom Kean, a Republican, and vice chair, former Democratic Representative Lee Hamilton of Indiana. Governor Tom Kean, Representative Lee Hamilton, welcome to the NewsHour.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So you say in this report, looking back 10 years, that the U.S. government has done a good job of fighting terrorism, but you also say, Tom Kean, that you warn the struggle against terrorism has entered a new and dangerous phase. What do you base that on?
Well, the threat is different, but it's no less. It's not one central al-Qaeda based in Afghanistan the way it was, trying to do a big operation. Now it's a scattered al-Qaeda affiliates in a number of parts of the world, many more countries than they were before. All want to do is harm, and all working on it in one way or another to do it. There are new bomb-making techniques coming out of one al-Qaeda group. There's ISIS, which is a great danger in another place, because they're training terrorists who could come over here anytime. So there's a lot going on. And the American people just can't be complacent. We need to protect ourselves now as much as we did the day before 9/11.
So, Lee Hamilton, does that mean we are not safer today?
I think we're safer than we were prior to 9/11. Not safe enough, and we still live in a dangerous world where a lot of people want to do us harm. So we must consider the urgency of the threat, keep it in front of the American people. We've got a pretty good record, not a perfect record. We've had no event like 9/11. We have had some incidents like Fort Hood and the Boston Marathon. But overall, all of the money we've spent, the organizations we've created, we have a good record, but not a perfect one.
Tom Kean, one of the things you say is that this lack of security today is partly the result of the U.S., quote, inability or reluctance to exert power and influence in a number of places. Are you saying if the U.S. had gone into Syria, for example, we wouldn't be in this situation?
There's some who'd say that. I wouldn't necessarily say it myself, and it's necessarily not what we're saying as a group. But yes, the United States the world can't do without us. I mean, we're the one power, neutral power, generally projected for democratic good in the world, and when we step back, a lot of other people rush in. And the world is now such a strange place with so many different areas, particularly since the Arab Spring. We said the one thing you can't allow is a place where terrorists can train and prepare the way they did in Afghanistan before 9/11. And those places are being created today.
But that would mean, Lee Hamilton, a more activist United States abroad militarily. The American people, though, don't have an appetite for that necessarily, do they?
Well, I think that it really is changing. We are not putting boots on the ground for combat. That's pretty clear. Policymakers don't come in with a clean slate. They know the American people don't want to get militarily involved there. What does that mean? What it means is you have to use other tools of power, and that can be covert action, it can be diplomacy, it can be political steps, economic leverage, all kinds of things, but we're not going to be putting troops on the ground. But as we withdraw, we take a major tool of American foreign policy out of the picture, we'll have to put other things in its place.
And are you saying the administration hasn't done that sufficiently?
I think they can always do better. They're doing it to some degree, but not the way I'd like to see it. We need, I think, to be involved, particularly in these areas in that part of the world that are so unsettled. We need America there. We need our principles, our morals, our democratic point of view expressed.
You also single out cyber threats as an area that you worry a great deal about.
We talk to every official having intelligence responsibilities in the Obama administration and people who have left the Obama administration. Every single one said cybersecurity was a real threat. Every single one of them said we're way behind on it. Some of them said we're the way we were before 9/11, the day before 9/11, as far as cyber goes. And so, we're having a huge transfer of knowledge. Secrets coming from the private sector, costing us jobs. Secrets coming from the Defense Department and some of our newest technology, all being stolen, and it's being done quietly. So the American people aren't really aware of how seriously it's affecting us.
And that gets to something that underlies this entire report, Lee Hamilton, and that is that you say the American people are just not sufficiently aware of how bad, how serious this threat is.
Well, they've become complacent, and why not? We haven't had an attack like 9/11. That's good. That's a success. But because of the success, they have become more complacent. What we worry about is that as they become more complacent, they won't talk to their representatives about it. Congress will reflect it, the executive branch will reflect it, and they'll cut appropriations, they'll lower their guard on counterterrorism efforts, and we're saying that would be a mistake, a big mistake.
And how much of this, Tom Kean, is the president's responsibility to make sure that people think about the threat that's still there?
I think a great deal of responsibility, because the president's the only one who can speak to the American people as a whole and rally them. This report is somewhat like an alarm bell in the night. I mean, there's very serious things going on here. We don't think the American people are aware of it. We don't think in some areas the government is as prepared as they should be for the threats out there. And we hope that the president will take the leadership in explaining the threat, and also explaining in more detail than he has the kind of steps we're going to take to meet the threat.
Sounding the alarm 10 years after the first 9/11 report. We thank you both, Congressman Lee Hamilton, Governor Tom Kean.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Again, the major developments of the day. Deputy National Security Advisor Ben Rhodes told the NewsHour U.S. intelligence has confirmed the missile that brought down Malaysia Air Flight 17 originated in Ukrainian territory controlled by pro-Russian separatists, but that it does not absolve Russia of complicity in the incident. And U.S., European, and Canadian airlines suspended flights to Israel's Ben Gurion Airport after Hamas rocket fire landed in a nearby suburb.
On the NewsHour online right now, one low-income neighborhood in Austin, Texas, is hoping to transform the community through street art. Artists and citizens are coming together, despite language barriers and cultural differences, to paint fences with the phrase, "Beauty will save the world." See what that looks like on Artbeat. All that and more is on our website, newshour.pbs.org.
And that's the NewsHour for tonight. On Wednesday, 100 days after those Nigerian schoolgirls went missing, we provide an update. I'm Gwen Ifill.
And I'm Judy Woodruff. We'll see you online and again here tomorrow evening. For all of us here at the PBS NewsHour, thank you and good night.